Good morning, Fairview family. It's good to see you, and I'm glad you're joining me today for the fifth study in a series of studies we've been doing entitled Let Hope In. Now, today's study is from the book of John chapter 18. So I want to encourage you, if you have your Bible, go ahead and take it and turn with me to John chapter 18. We're also going to look at John chapter 21 today, so you might want to have your fingers ready there. Put a little bookmark in there in John 21. But let's start in John 18. The title of our message today, our study, is called Hope Renewed. Hope Renewed. As a kid, I grew up in Shreveport on a dead-end street. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed living on a dead-end street. We lived on a little cul-de-sac. And as kids, we often loved playing on our quiet little circle. There were very few times when we ever had to stop a baseball game or a kickball game for traffic. I mean, very few people ever came down our little dead-end street. But if they ever did, if a car or anyone ever came down our street, their only option really was to turn around. It was to turn around, make the loop, and head back out the way they came. There was nowhere else to go. Now, you know what? I got to thinking more about that. That when you realize that you've come to a dead end in life, when you get to that place where you feel like your only option is to turn around and find somewhere else to go, when there's really nowhere else to go, your best option, and in fact, in truth, your only option, is to turn to Christ, to turn to your Creator, to the one who made you. And that's really what we're going to look at today. You know, Christ can be our guide, and He wants to be our guide through life. And not only be our guide, but Christ gives us hope. He can renew our hope when we've lost all hope and we don't know what else to do and we don't know what's going to come in the days ahead. He's the one we look to. He's the one we turn to. As a matter of fact, we really don't need to wait till we're at a dead end. We need to turn to Christ before we ever get to the dead end. And I think that's really what we want to look at today in this lesson. That hope is available to everyone. But unfortunately, some people, and in fact, many people, have little hope because they're unwilling to deal with failure and they're unwilling to turn to Christ. Now, I hope you're there in John 18 because in just a second, we're going to look at a man who learned how to deal with his failure by ultimately turning to Christ. Let's start our lesson with a question like we do each week. And here's a question for you to ponder just for a minute. What are different ways that people respond to failure? Think on that for a second. What are some different ways that people typically respond to failure? Now, I guess you could maybe list a number of ways or a lot of lengthy ways people might handle failure, but in fact, in most of your answers, I think what you'll find is this: failure is painful. Failure is painful, and no matter how we try to deal with it, it doesn't escape the fact that it is a difficult and painful experience. And those moments when we fall flat on our face, those moments when we make ourselves look foolish and we feel foolish and we come to that point where we have to admit that we've done something wrong and we failed, those aren't fun moments. Those are difficult moments to deal with on any day of the week. And there's really, I guess, in essence, two ways or two types, let's say it that way, two types of failure. The first type of failure, I think that most of us experience, and maybe we don't even realize it in the moment, is when you do something that you really don't realize is wrong. Now, later on, you come to figure that out, but you do something you didn't even realize it was wrong. Like, for instance, maybe you're driving in your car and you're headed down the road and you go through a speed zone change and you didn't see the sign. You didn't see the speed zone change from 55 to 45. And so in that moment, when the policeman pulls you over for speeding, you're wondering, what in the world? What did I do wrong? I mean, you really weren't even aware of your failure to slow down. You didn't know you were supposed to. So there are those rare moments, and there's those times when we do things and we just didn't even know we did anything wrong. We didn't know we failed until someone else pointed it out. But there, more often than not, we experience a second type of failure, and we know it. We're aware of it. Because it's when you know what is right. It's when you know what to do, and you don't do it. You choose not to do it. And you deliberately choose instead to do the wrong thing and choose not to do what you know you should. And this just isn't a mistake. It's sin. And we've all done that. We've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God at some point in our life. Now, at times, we all not only fall short and sin against God, but we all struggle to get over that failure. We struggle to deal with that failure. So what we find is this: it's not a question of if we fail, of if we're going to sin. No, the question is, when we sin, when we fail, what do we do with it? How do we deal with it? And so what we're going to do today is we're going to examine two key points in Peter's life where he failed, and then he had to learn what to do with it, how to deal with it. And hopefully we'll learn from him and from his mistake. So I guess the key point today is this: that when you fail, Jesus will restore you. It's not only that he can or is able, because he is able and can, but it's that he will. If you'll turn to Christ, he will restore you. So let's look at John chapter 18. We're going to start in verse 15, and we're kind of diving in a sense, to the middle of a story. Now, it's you'll see as we start reading, it's as if we're in the beginning of a story, but in fact, we're in the middle of a larger story. And this is happening on the night of Jesus' betrayal, when he's arrested, and that's where this story takes place. Some of you say, oh, I know this story well. You've read this story a lot. Maybe this is new to you, so maybe this will be a new story. But basically, these verses recount one of the worst moments in Peter's life, because soldiers at this point have come to the Garden of Gethsemane in Jerusalem, just outside of Jerusalem. They've come at night to arrest Jesus. Not only have they come to arrest Jesus, but they've come to take him to the high priest. Now, when this happens, Peter tries to be valiant. You know, Peter tries to be courageous. He pulls a sword even in the moment and tries to defend Jesus, ends up cutting a man's ear off. Jesus heals the man's ear. And, you know, that was probably kind of almost an embarrassing or humiliating moment for Peter to a point. I mean, here he was trying to help Jesus, and Jesus rebuked him for doing that, rebuked him for pulling the sword and injuring that man. And so it was a difficult moment for Peter in that moment, but it really got tough after they got into the city to the high priest's house. And that's really kind of where we're going to pick up our story here. So John 18, verse 15, it says, "Meanwhile, Simon Peter was following Jesus, as was another disciple. That disciple was an acquaintance of the high priest. So he went in with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter remained outside. He was standing outside by the door. So the other disciple, the one known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the girl who was the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. Then the slave girl who was the doorkeeper said to Peter, 'You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?' 'I am not,' he said. Now the slaves and the temple police had made a charcoal fire because it was cold. They were standing there warming themselves, and Peter was standing with them, warming himself." Now, this is one of those moments where Peter previously had been so courageous, or attempted to be, and Jesus had to stop him. He had to pull the reins. And now, when he's in a position where he needs to be courageous, he needs to make a stand, and he needs to be there for Christ, he struggles and he fails. And now it's really gonna hurt him. Gonna hurt his pride, gonna hurt his heart. You know, if you think about it, this was the same Simon who had his name changed to Peter, and Peter meant stone or rock. Peter was supposed to be the immovable rock, but he's more like a rolling stone in this moment. He's one who gets tossed about. He gets pushed aside because of his own weakness and because of his pride in his own life. And I think we all can identify with Peter to a point right here. We've probably had moments like this. Rather than being brave like when Peter walked out on that water, you know, when Jesus called to him, or when he said, "Jesus, you are the Christ, the Son of God," when nobody else was willing to say that. Peter had those courageous moments, but rather than being that same Peter, here he was caving into the flesh and denying that he even knew Jesus. Now, I just wonder, how many times have I been in that position? How many times have I been like Peter right there? How many times have you done that too? And we have to be honest. There's been probably more times than we care to admit where we've acted just like that. We've had a time when we failed to be a faithful follower of Jesus. So for Peter, though, this isn't just a one-time deal. This isn't just a one-time occurrence. Unfortunately, this is something he'll struggle with more, and we've all experienced that. We've all struggled with this probably more than once in our life as well. So let's keep looking at this. Look at now verse 25. We're going to skip down a little bit in the story. And in verse 25, we're picking up again with Peter outside in the courtyard around that campfire, all right, that charcoal fire. Verse 25. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. They said to him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" So first the servant girl asked, and now it's these other men. All right. Notice verse 25. He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the high priest's slaves, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, said, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Peter then denied it again. Immediately, a rooster crowed. Two more times, Peter is asked if he knew Jesus. The third guy even thought he recognized Peter from the garden incident, from the arrest itself. 3 times now, Peter denied Christ, and finally, a rooster crowed. Peter felt like a chicken, didn't he? I've been there. Man, I've had a rooster crow on me many times. I'm not talking about literally, but in the background of my mind, I knew I was a chicken too. And there's times when I chickened out when I should have spoke up, when I should have said something more about Jesus. But I know this, it's easy, and it's really dangerous even for us to see the men and the women of the scriptures sometimes as larger than life. I do this sometimes, and you may do this as well. I think sometimes we do 2 things. We blow up their victories. We hold them up so high and see them as larger than life characters in their victories. And at the same time, I think we also, when we see their failures like this, we tend to see it as so catastrophic. But in fact, we need to realize that we ourselves are in the same situation. We probably look at these stories sometimes and we think, oh, I'd never make a mistake like Peter made. I'd never do that. If I was put in that situation, I wouldn't fail Jesus. I'd come through. Oh, really? Oh, really? It seems like Peter said something a whole lot like that too once, didn't he? At the Passover meal, Peter told Jesus, "Jesus, I'll never deny you. I'll never forsake you. I'll be there. I'll always come through for you, Jesus." But guess who's eating crow now, right? Well, guess who's feeling like a chicken now, right? That's really the issue. So it may be that we really aren't that different from Peter after all. And I think for each of us, we really need to be careful that we don't get prideful and think that we couldn't fail in the same way. But here's the fact. If we have failed like this, like Peter, if we have struggled the way Peter struggled, we don't need to give up. And we don't need to just feel like we're useless and God can't use us. Because I want you to see something. I want you to see what happened to Peter. Because thankfully, God didn't leave him in the quicksand of denial. You know, he was sinking deep in his own sin, but God rescued him. God loved him. And Jesus did something amazing for him. So let's look at this. Turn to John chapter 21. In John chapter 21, this is after the crucifixion, and it's after the resurrection. And so this is the last chapter of John's gospel. And here we're going to see what happens with Peter and how Jesus helps Peter deal with this failure that he's made. Now, thankfully, Jesus doesn't let us wallow in our failures, because we could do that. We could just kind of, when we fail him, say, oh, that's it, and want to give up and roll around in it for a while and just feel sorry for ourselves all the time. But in these early verses of John chapter 21, we're learning that Peter and some of his friends were struggling that way. They were wallowing in it. They didn't know what to do. And Peter said, I know what I'm doing. I'm going fishing. I may not can fish for men anymore, but I'll go fish for fish because I know I can do that. So he and his friends, they went out there to get in the boat and do some fishing. But even though they had seen and heard the resurrected Christ, think about this. They've already seen and heard about the resurrected Christ, but they're still not ready. They're still not ready to fulfill the purpose Christ had called them to. They're still not ready to go fish for men. And you may say, well, why? Why not? Well, Peter probably didn't feel worthy. I mean, you can imagine that. He probably didn't feel worthy to even bear the name of Christ, much less share the name of Christ, and talk about Jesus. He probably felt like he just was washed up, frankly. Well, while he's out fishing, he and his friends have been fishing obviously for a long time, and they're probably tired and they're ready to quit and come in for the day, but they're still out there. And as Peter looks toward the shore, he and John and the others, they see a man on the shore who's waving toward them. And as they listen, they can hear him shouting out across the water. And he's asking them, "Have you caught anything?" And they're thinking, who is this guy? Who's this guy on the shore, worried about whether we've been catching fish or not? And no, we hadn't caught anything, they reply. He said, well, cast your net on the other side of the boat. Don't you know what Peter was thinking at this point? Who's this joker? Who's this cat telling us how to fish? We've been fishing our whole life, but they did. For whatever reason, in that moment, they stopped and they took their nets and they cast them on the other side of the boat. Now, you know the story. Some of you already know what happened. If the story's new to you, here's what's so amazing. In that very moment, the Bible says that fish began literally jumping into the net. They began jumping into the net, and the boat began to capsize. The net became so heavy that it almost began to sink. The nets were tearing, and they were in a kind of in a panic. And John, in the moment, realizes it's Jesus, and he says, "It is the Lord. It's the Lord." He begins to shout. Peter looks again, sees, recognizes that it is in fact Jesus, and he doesn't waste any time. He jumps into the water and begins swimming to the shore. The others begin to follow in the boat and begin making their way to the shore. When they get to the shore, Peter and those disciples gather around Jesus, and what's amazing is this: Jesus begins to recreate the scene of that last night of Peter's denial. Jesus has a charcoal fire there on the seashore, a little campfire going. It's only the second time in the New Testament where the word for charcoal is used in the scriptures. It's used at the time when Peter denied Christ, and it's used here. Now, why is that important? Jesus is recreating the scene. He's taking Peter back with his senses, with his visual, with the smell of the fire, with the sound of the crackle. He wants to put Peter back in that moment. He wants to take him back to that painful experience of when he failed the Lord. And you say, why would Jesus do something like that? Why would he let this man have to relive that moment in his mind and go back there? Because Jesus knew Peter needed help. Peter was a wandering warrior at this point. He's a struggling servant of the Lord, and he needs help. I love the way that Jesus does this. He's really trying to put Peter in a place where genuine healing can take place. Well, let's see what happens. Let's read about the conversation. So if you're there in John 21, pick up in verse 15. In verse 15, it says, when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said to him. "You know that I love you." "Feed my lambs," he told him. A second time he asked him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," he said to him. "You know that I love you." "Shepherd my sheep," he told him. He asked him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved that he asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." "Feed my sheep," Jesus said. "I assure you, when you were young, you would tie your belt and walk wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will tie you and carry you where you don't want to go." He said this to signify but what kind of death he would glorify God. After saying this, he told him, "Follow me." Now, this is an extraordinary moment. And there's a great quote that Pete Wilson has in the study that helps us think about what's going on in this moment. Pete says it this way: time doesn't heal all wounds. God heals wounds. Listen to that. Time doesn't heal all wounds. God heals wounds. Now, I've probably heard people, you've probably heard people say this, I know I have, where they say, "Oh, time heals everything." Well, time really doesn't heal everything, but Jesus can. He really can. And Jesus puts him in a position where it's almost like he's opening that wound. I mean, he really is. He's opening that wound in Peter's heart. As a matter of fact, when Jesus takes this moment to ask these 3 questions of Peter, and Peter now has to respond 3 times, but this time he's putting Peter in a position where he can affirmatively, he can faithfully answer the questions. Before, he failed to answer the questions like he should, but now he's helping Peter to do it. So Jesus is, in essence, not only restoring this man's confidence in his own ability to follow Christ, but he's also increasing his faith, and he's increasing his willingness and readiness to obey and to follow Jesus. And that's really what faith's about. It's trusting Jesus and obeying Jesus. It's loving Jesus more than we love our own life and loving this world. And so Jesus is helping Peter to regain that confidence and regain that faith in his heart and in his life. And I think this is really an important moment for Peter. You notice how Jesus uses the 3 questions, and each time he's asking him about his love, and he's asking him about his commitment, and he's asking about his desire to do what is right and to follow through in it, and ultimately to follow Christ, to again fulfill that calling that Christ gave to his life when he called him to be a fisher of men, and he's restoring him to that place. I think really there's 2 parts to restoration. There's 2 parts of restoration. One, your past is forgiven, and that happens here. Jesus doesn't hold Peter's failure over his head anymore. After this moment, it's over with. He's not going to get into that anymore. He's not going to talk about that anymore, because the beginning of forgiveness is the decision not to seek vengeance and not to hold someone's trespasses over their head. You know, people will say, oh, you need to forgive and forget. In truth, only God can forgive and forget. Only God can forget. We can all forgive. We can learn to forgive, but we can't really forget. But here's what's amazing. Even though we can't forget what happens to us, we can make a decision not to hold that against somebody for the rest of their life. We can make the decision not to hold that over their head, and that is forgiveness. And if we continue to bring things up, if we continue to open that wound over and over and over again, guess what? We've never given them forgiveness. So forgiveness is a two-way street. We need to learn to give forgiveness, and others need to learn to accept forgiveness. And Jesus is modeling that for Peter right here. He's helping him to see that and to understand that. Because Jesus doesn't hold grudges, he holds grace. And that's important to know, and that's good to know. All right, but there's a second part to restoration. Not only is our past forgiven, but also our future is radically different. So Jesus called Peter to a future of serving and loving people, in particular God's people. Peter, after this point, becomes one of the greatest evangelists to the lost, but he also becomes a great shepherd for sheep who come into God's family. He does both of those things. He's like an evangelist on one hand, and he's kind of like a pastor on the other, a missionary pastor. So Peter does all those things, and God uses him in a tremendous way. Well, this story has really helped us to put into perspective the fact that, like Peter, when we come to Christ in repentance, when we get to that dead-end moment and we turn to Jesus, he will forgive our sin. He will restore our life. And he'll put us into service in his kingdom. And there we will find our hope renewed.